Is prepping really worth it? What are the odds of a catastrophe happening in your lifetime large enough to justify all of the time, money, and energy you've been pouring into preparing for it? Here's why that's not a crazy question. In 1859, there was a massive solar flare. It was recorded by a guy looking through his telescope. His last name was Carrington. They ended up calling it the Carrington event. But it was so large that when it hit the Earth, it fried all of our electronics. And we didn't have electronics then like we do now. We had telegraph machines, and the poles and the wires were sparking and lit on fire. Some of the telegraph operators even got electrocuted sitting at their machines. In the cities, people would see these auroras, these bright lights in the skies, yellows and reds, bright enough to be able to read a newspaper out on the street at night. And this wasn't just in the US, this was all across the globe. Europe got it just as bad as we did. A lot of people thought this was the end of days, which is understandable because in 1859, we didn't have an electrical grid. We were still using gas lamps and we didn't have modern electricity. But our communications have become so crucial that having a communication grid completely down was essentially the same feeling that we might have today having our internet go down. It must have felt catastrophic to them at the time. That wasn't the only coronal mass injection that we've ever had. We had another one in 2012 that just missed us. It kind of went off out into space because of the angle of the sun. So we got really lucky that that did not directly impact us, because now the whole world runs on electricity, obviously, and that would have taken everything down. Internet, all of our main substations, it would have been catastrophic. It would have been like going back in time to 1859, essentially. We would have lost everything. And we'd still be recovering from that today. It takes years to build these huge transformers that will be fried in this type of event. In fact, my solar array out here is hardened for EMP, and the coronal mass injections are a little bit less brutal than an EMP. I think I could survive it, but there's no telling. But the world outside of our ranch for sure would be in complete disarray. So the danger is real. The question is whether or not preparing for it pays, or whether your time and money spent on this would be better off spent doing something else. By the end of this video, I'll give you a number, so let's run it. The likelihood of a catastrophic event happening in our lifetimes is higher than you might think. And usually it's not just one thing, it is a compounding effect. So you have an event, and then you have all the residual events that happen as a result of a lack of preparedness nationally or globally to be able to deal with that threat. I'll give you another example. I'm somewhat fascinated by history because if we can't learn from our past, we are doomed to repeat it. I just read a book called The Great Influenza by John Barry. It came out in 2004. It's a beautifully well-written, quite a thick book. It's about 600 pages, but it's a sort of non-politically charged account of what actually happened. And I can tell you that modern society at that time was coming apart at the seams. The effects of the influenza, or the Spanish flu that spread across the globe in 1918, was catastrophic. There was something called cyanosis, where your oxygen couldn't distribute well from your lungs throughout your body, and it would cause you to turn blue. Some people were so dark that they were virtually purple. You couldn't tell what race they were. They were dying all over the place from this really nasty effect on the lungs, this form of pneumonia. And bodies were just stacking up everywhere. And we were in the middle of a war. We were nearing the end of the First World War. So we were sending our troops over ship after ship, cramming them into these sardine cans where it would just spread, and just a very small portion of them would actually make it. But we would not stop sending these ships over and over again to avoid the appearance of being weak to our enemies, even though that it was very inefficient to send, let's say hundreds of men and only a few dozen make it there and be able to fight in the war effort. Nonetheless, that's what happened. And of course, the army camps all around the United States were just completely decimated due to the terrible conditions and the overcrowding. So this flu was absolutely, orders of magnitude worse than what my recollection of our more recent pandemic was. You always feel like you're in modern times, whatever era you're in. And it just goes to show that nature can rear its ugly head and almost take out an entire civilization. I think we came close to a complete societal meltdown several times throughout the multiple waves of that pandemic. So looking back at history, you can start to see patterns forming. Now, there's several that I left out, so I wanted to make this chart just to fill in the blanks with a few other diseases that were deemed pandemics in their day, and to show the difference in how these are becoming actually a little bit more frequent. The Carrington event was 1859, and then 59 years later, we had the 1918 influenza. And then 84 to 85 years later, we had the SARS epidemic. Then only 6 to 7 years later, we had the H1N1 swine flu. Then in 2012, just 3 years later, we had the near-miss solar storm from the coronal mass injection that just barely missed us by about 9 days. If Earth's rotation in the solar system had been 9 days ahead of where it was, we would have been a direct hit. So that was very close. Then we had COVID-19 just 7 to 8 years after that in 2019, 2020. And now today, it's only been 6 to 7 years since the COVID epidemic. Can you believe it's been that long? But I guess the question really is, you're starting to see a frequency increase and a tempo that is picking up, I believe. Maybe it's always been that way. We just don't have as clear a recollection of some of the events that were occurring all throughout history. I know we had some nasty things that aren't on this chart. Well, I know you can please leave them in the comment down below. I'd love to hear it. But I know I don't have everything. This isn't a comprehensive list, but this is just an example. This is only coronal mass injections and flus. This isn't wars or civil unrest or anything else. Civil unrest has a tendency to be more regional, less global. I think that we could have a civil war, which would be a countrywide phenomenon. We've had that before. Obviously, we could have it again, but I think that's a lot less likely than something that would be considered a black swan event. But really, when you dig down into the numbers, a pandemic and a coronal mass injection is not really a black swan. Let's look at the numbers. There's a solar physicist by the name of Pete Riley. Dr. Riley's mathematic prediction is less about predicting a specific calendar date and much more about warning of our highly technologically dependent society that a catastrophic, society-altering solar superstorm is a statistical certainty over a long enough time period. He calculated that the Earth faces an approximate 12% chance per decade of being struck by a Carrington-class coronal mass injection. Because our modern electrical grid and our satellite communications and GPS networks are incredibly fragile, and his models suggest that a direct hit from such an extreme event would trigger widespread, multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure failures. Consequently, his core message for our future is that we must concentrate on severe space weather, not as a rare black swan anomaly, but as an inevitable operational hazard that requires urgent global fortification, advanced machine learning prediction models, and robust hardening efforts. In 2022, there was a documentary featuring Dennis Quaid called Grid Down, Power Up, and it's an eye-opening look at how vulnerable the United States is. Our infrastructure is not capable of withstanding an EMP, period. I don't think the global powers would do this. It's too hard to communicate and carry on the continuity of all the other shenanigans that they have up their sleeves if they blow up the whole grid. Why would you want the U.S. to go dark and go basically back into the early 1900s? I don't see them doing that, but it could still happen from one of our nutcase neighbors somewhere around the world. Could be North Korea, could be Iran. Who knows? Somebody could do this. It would be absolutely catastrophic. There was a commission developed called the EMP Commission by the U.S. government, and they determined that, we stand no chance of getting back to normal for many, many years, and it would affect over 90% of Americans. In fact, they even estimated that over 90% of Americans would not survive a large-scale EMP attack on the United States. So losing the grid would be catastrophic, and there would be no recovering anytime in our lifetime. So that's one of the reasons why I have a solar power system to stave off the very immediate effects of that. Now, over time, I would probably need maintenance and parts, and my whole system could fall apart, and then we'd all be in the same boat. But at least it is a time-preserving barrier. It gives you time to react, just like stored food and stored water and all of your other preps. What we're doing is buying time, and you're going to need to figure out what's going on. And, it would take, communications could be down. It could take weeks or months to even find out what exactly is going on and the extent of the damage and what caused it. So, a lot of the preps are really just buying time before we end up going back to more traditional ways of living if it is a prolonged grid down situation where, eventually all your preps are going to be gone. You're going to use everything up, and your system may or may not be something you can maintain with your skill set. So these are all things that I think about. Now, one more thing on the pandemic front, I do talk a lot about disease spreading because I'm PTSD from COVID probably. And I also talk a lot about electronic failures or the inability to get fuels, modern fuels. And that's electricity, diesel, gasoline, propane. because I do believe these are some of our biggest vulnerabilities. So there was an observational study, I'm going to read this to make sure I don't screw it up, led by Dr. Marco Morani at the University of Padua. They analyzed historic pandemics over 4 centuries and determined that an extremely novel disease outbreak on the scale of COVID-19 is highly likely to occur, and the probability of experiencing similar pandemics like that in one's lifetime is at 38%. Well, accuracy, it turns out, really matters. And the authors of that study eventually caught a coding error and published a correction, and the numbers came down. So the COVID scale event now looks closer to once every 130 years. That's not me poking holes, that's just science correcting itself, which makes me feel like I can trust that study a lot more. And even corrected, that still stands at a near 40% chance over the next 75 years. And researchers warn that the odds are climbing as we push deeper into habitat and move faster around the globe. You know, that's kind of where we stand with the pandemic front. Now, one more to set the ceiling here. There was an Oxford philosopher named Toby Ord that tried to tally up every catastrophe that could possibly end us: pandemics, nuclear war, climate-related disasters, or runaway technology like AI destroying us. And he put the odds of a civilization-ending event this century at 1 in 6. So the odds of 1 in 6 is the same as Russian roulette. I don't know about you, but that's not a very comfortable number for me. And almost all of it was man-made. So, you know, we are our own worst enemy, and it makes you think about things in cycles. And the book, The Fourth Turning. And as you look back in time and see civilizations rise and fall, you have to scratch your head and wonder, you know, are we nearing some sort of a change, a significant change? Now, here's where I think people get it wrong, is they look at a single prediction for, like, say, a solar storm, it being 12%. Now, that's pretty low, but it's just one of the many threats that there's a percentage on. So when you compound them together, you have a much higher likelihood than a single event. So what is your actual chance of experiencing a calamity like this in your lifetime over the next, let's say, 60 to 75 years? And I think for most of us watching this channel, we don't expect to live that long, but that's got a little margin of error for potential longevity escape velocity, you know, assuming we can stay alive another 10 to 15 years longer due to technology, and that's probably likely. So let's run the numbers on, let's just say 2 of them right now: a solar storm, a Carrington event, or a pandemic. It's close to a coin flip, each one. So if you put them together, the odds of just one of them hitting you is about 7 in 10. 7 in 10. That's pretty crappy odds. And then if you add in all of the other things that could possibly happen in there, like, you know, financial collapse, regional disasters of some sort, an attack on the grid, then they all stack up, and it becomes more obvious that not prepping is a more aggressive bet. I think that prepping is basically like fire insurance. You don't get fire insurance expecting a fire. It's a small amount of money that you put in each month or each year to stave off complete total wipeout. And it makes sense. That's why we all have insurance. I mean, it hurts. No one really wants to pay for insurance. No one really wants to prep because it does take a lot of time, resources, and energy, like I said in the beginning of the video. But in the end, it's a very small amount to be able to have continuity of food, water, power, electricity, security, everything that you would need. So if the switch just went pop and you won't have any warning, do you think the sun's going to warn you? Or a pandemic didn't warn us, you know, during COVID. It just happens very quickly over a matter of days. And EMP, some sort of nuclear attack, or a solar event is instant with no warning. And then you've got your pants, you know, down around your ankles and running around like an idiot. I just don't want to be that guy. So for me, if you really take a hard look at this, and that's what I tried to do in this video, to share with you a realistic look at the likelihood of something pretty severe happening, and I think it's high enough to where this makes a lot of sense. If you're still here and you like this kind of content, I've got another video I think you'd really like about a guy that survived in a city that was under a military blockade in the Balkans during the Bosnian War. I'll leave that video right here.